Mysteries of alien beings. Who are they, and where do they come from? Are they real or imagined? In recent years, hundreds of people have come forward with startling accounts of abduction by alien beings. For many abductees, the memories are triggered by a vivid dream.
I was starting to have nightmares, really terrible nightmares that I could not explain. I found myself in a very brightly lit room. I had no idea where I was or why I was there. And while I'm trying to figure this out, I notice this figure, or a dark, shadowy type figure emerging from this light, this bright light in front of me. It wasn't like other nightmares where you have just some strange, dumb dream or something and you forget about it the next day. This would stick with me for days and days. It was like I couldn't think about anything else. I couldn't function. It was horrible.
Not so long ago, it seemed inconceivable that aliens and UFOs had become the topics of everyday conversation. Yet a recent poll revealed that nearly half of all Americans now believe that UFOs are real. In the next hour, a new, in-depth look at what may be the most remarkable phenomenon of our age.
Howdy, folks, and welcome back to another episode of your favorite podcast, That Would Be Rad. We're a podcast that majors in 80s and 90s nostalgia, comic culture, all things paranormal, and minors in retro video games, tabletop RPGs, pre-internet mysteries, and trying to raise our kids to be half as cool as we were back in the 80s. We're your hosts, Woody Brown.
And Tyler Benz. How's it going, pal?
Oh, man. To say that I'm not excited today, you know, coming in here.
Coming in hot,
man, this season already. I mean, dude, I can't believe we opened this season up with one of our all-time favorites, The Count of St. Germain. I mean, dude, I've been wanting to tell that story for so long, and we just finally, I think we were intimidated by it because there's just so much.
Oh, big time.
And we mentioned that last week. So if you haven't heard that episode, go back and listen to last week.
Yeah.
It's not related basically in any way to what we're going to talk about today.
No.
But,
although the Patreon, the newest Patreon that's about to drop is directly tied to it.
Yes. And we kind of go over more about our just thoughts in general about the Count of St. Germain and all that stuff. But yeah, today we're talking about something completely different. We're going to take you on a journey into one of the most intense, terrifying alien abduction cases ever recorded.
Yeah.
This one's kind of got a little bit of everything. It's got, you know, the outdoors, the wilderness, strange lights in the sky, missing time, hypnotic regressions, shadowy figures, time, and a group of friends just trying to have a nice vacation together, you know, getting their canoe out there, paddling along, just trying to, you know, just live the dream out in the late 70s United States of America. Today we're talking about the Allagash abductions.
One of the, for my money, I would say that this case is one of the, if not the most credible. It just, as far as like, if you're coming from like a debunker perspective, which if you are, you're
debunker, or maybe just like a peppering of skeptic.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, skepticism's great, but you know, even your like hardcore like debunkers, like this checks off those boxes that usually the debunkers love to, you know, sort of gloat about, like, oh, well, they didn't pass this test, or this didn't, you know.
Right.
And this one, man, it I don't know, it's terrifying.
And it's kind of reminiscent of one that we're going to talk about later this season, suggested by one of our newer listeners, Lou. If you're listening, I promise we didn't skip over that one that you're talking about. This one just kind of happened to come first alphabetically. So without further ado, listeners, turn the volume up, settle in, and let's get weird. Our story begins with 4 friends, brothers Jim and Jack Weiner. For all of you 12-year-olds out there laughing right now, I get it. I was 12 once too, and Tyler still is.
Yeah.
They're along with their college buddies Charles Foltz and Charles Rak. These guys weren't just...
Weiner and Rak.
Yeah.
That's the last names.
And two of them are named Charles and, Jim and Jack. There's a lot of, alliteration? Anyway,
Yeah.
These guys aren't just random campers. They were art students from Massachusetts College of Art and Design, heading out for what was supposed to be a long canoeing and camping trip through the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. Now, for those of you not from the United States, the Allagash Wilderness is located in sort of the northernmost part of Maine, which is, far northeast of the United States. Mm-hmm. And it's, kind of... Rural, but I think the population not too long ago was less than 1,000.
Oh,
okay?
Wow.
But
still less than 1,000.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thousands and thousands of acreage out there of wilderness in that area. Mm-hmm. So it's really just kind of you're out in it. You're going to get away from technology. And this is, of course, this is the late 70s, 1976 to be exact. But, they're getting away from even the hustle and bustle that they knew in Massachusetts at the time. So these 4 guys are paddling through the untouched beauty of Maine. They're fishing. They're telling stories around the fire. Just, classic adventure vibes. It's, like I said, August 1976. I kind of imagine them sort of heading out there in a pickup truck. They got all their gear in the back. They're listening on, I guess maybe an 8-track. They've got some Creedence Clearwater Revival going. They've maybe got a little Eagles or... I saw that in this same month, Boston released their debut album. So maybe they're just jamming out, carefree, heading out together.
Blue Oyster Cult. Uriah Heep.
Yeah, man. All that kind of stuff. Late 70s rock is really rad. Mm-hmm. The first day or so went by without a hitch. Beautiful scenery, fresh air, campfires crackling in the night. But on the second night... things started to get a little strange. Jim Weiner was the first to notice something in the sky. At first, it just looked like a light. Bright, unmoving, hovering above the trees. He grabbed a pair of binoculars and focused in on it. And just as he was starting to wrap his head around what he was looking at, poof. It blinked out. But not in a way that seemed natural. More like the way an old television screen might shut off, fading inward from the edges until nothing remained. Which all of you, I guess, what do they call them if they're younger than millennials?
Generation X?
No.
Oh, younger.
Yeah.
Oh, it's Generation Z?
I don't know, but anybody that
Gen Z,
isn't familiar with the old school tube TVs probably doesn't, they don't get that reference. But, you remember you'd turn either physically with your hand or later with a remote control, you turn that TV off and it was like all the light came in and then there was like a single point.
Yeah,
that just disappeared at the end. I always thought that was cool.
Which, by the way, I figured out this really cool hack as a kid. My mom made me put tinsel on the Christmas tree. And there's a trick where the screen will magnetically hold the tinsel. So literally I would just put tons of tinsel on it. And then when you turn the screen on, it shoots the tinsel out and shocks you.
And there you go, folks. You get a firsthand sort of peek into the type of kid that Tyler was.
Yeah. Well, the 80s and 90s, we didn't have iPads, so we played with tinsel and tube televisions.
Anyway, so again, the light kind of faded out, unnatural, right? It stood out to him as whoa, that was weird. Now, Jim apparently wasn't really the kind of guy that would just jump to conclusions. In fact, he figured maybe it was just an aircraft or some other natural phenomenon that he didn't really know about, and he just kind of let it go. But as we all know, when it comes to stories like these, It's never really the end of it. It's just the beginning.
Yeah.
So let's fast forward a couple nights. These guys have now been sort of, again, they're sort of canoeing, and throughout the day they'll either stop and fish or, check some things out. But then at night they'll kind of like make camp on land and tie off their canoe and just kind of like chill. So now they're sort of out near this lake and they're fishing from their canoe at night under a blanket of stars. And I just imagine they're just out on this still water. There's not really, we're not talking Lake Lanier where we're at. In other words, there's no ghost popping up. Or,
right. No blue ladies.
A bunch of boats, just flying by. It's just still. And so to me, it's like, man, that sky probably reflecting off that water. It just kind of looks really
gorgeous.
Cool.
Gorgeous.
Yeah. As a precaution, before they kind of got back in the canoe to head out into the middle of this water, they built this huge bonfire on the shore, so kind of to serve as like a beacon to guide them back and as a way to keep warm once they got there. But as they floated in this darkness out in the lake, something else caught their attention.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
There's something out there waiting for us. And it ain't no dead.
Hey, this is Woody.
And this is Tyler. And you're listening to That Would Be Rad.
And now back to our show. Charles Rak described it first. It was a feeling. That eerie, sort of unmistakable sensation that someone or something is watching you. It's the primary purpose Tyler and I always talk about.
Yeah.
You gotta close your blinds.
Always. Even when you're camping in the forest.
Yeah, well, you don't have blinds there. So he turns around, he looks up, and there it was again. This massive, glowing orb, just like the one they'd seen 2 nights earlier. And this time, though, for whatever reason, they decided to test it. So Charles Foltz picks up his flashlight and, in a move straight out of maybe Stranger Things or any other 80s horror movie, began to signal at it in Morse code, SOS. Now, dude, I gotta say, and I think the listeners can already tell, Tyler probably would have done that. He's shocking himself with tinsel. I, on the other hand, absolutely, if I'm seeing a light in the sky, I'm not going, I'm not starting to flash at it, SOS. If anything, I'm just going to kind of like, hopefully it doesn't notice me, and I'll observe it from a safe distance. Especially if you're just surrounded by water, and all you have to kind of get yourself back to safety, so to speak, is your paddle.
Well, you say that I probably would do that, but
Definitely do it.
no, this is one of those things that for some reason, I've always been against that. And I think even when I see, for you ufology folks who are fans of Dr. Stephen Greer, he's real big on using the laser pointer lights, and trying to use sort of telepathy and
Communicate, open line of communication. Basically.
to me that it kind of, it's sort of on that same trail as Ouija boards, and
Right.
when you look at the abyss looks back kind of.
Right. Exactly.
I'm not a fan.
Well, that makes me feel better. So I guess we can go camping together now.
Yeah.
Again, for me, the last thing I'm doing is inviting whatever it is to come any closer or to know that I'm there. But that's exactly what happened. The light, right after they sent that, responded. As soon as they had sent the signal, the object shifted course and started heading straight for them. And when I say straight for them, I mean full speed ahead, no hesitation, no question about intent. This thing was just locked onto them like a heat-seeking missile. So, of course, panic sets in. These 4 guys start paddling as hard as they can, really desperately trying to get back to the shore. But the light was gaining on them. Jim Weiner sort of glances over his shoulder, and then what he saw next kind of just sent ice through his veins. He sees this object that was massive, around 80 feet in diameter. And it's, at this point, almost on top of them. It was so close that Jim was convinced he could have thrown a rock and hit it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light vanished. It shot up into the sky at impossible speed, shrinking down to a tiny star before disappearing completely. Now, you'd think the guys would be celebrating, right? I mean, at this point, they've made it back to shore, still alive, no creatures or anything in sight, no aliens. But when they get there, they notice something really strange too. That massive bonfire that they made, something that should have been blazing for hours, I mean, it was massive, was nothing more than a pile of smoldering embers. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, how do they know? What if they're just burning, because certain pines and stuff will burn faster and all that. All the men agree that they were out there on the lake for less than 20 minutes. This huge bonfire should have blazed bright for hours, much less 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Somehow, despite their belief, though, that only minutes had passed, they realized hours must have actually gone by. We're talking about a pretty huge missing time situation here. But instead of trying to rebuild the fire or discuss it any further, surprisingly, they all ended up just going to bed. Here's some actual audio of Jack Weiner recalling the events of that night after they had seen the object.
The unusual thing is that we didn't stay up for hours and discuss this thing, which is what you would think, 4 young guys on a camping trip would do. And we just seemed very fatigued, and we just wanted to go to bed. The next morning, we got up and got our camp together and paddled to the next campsite.
Man, that's such a common thing, though, in these events. It's like they're just like, okay, let's just go to bed. Or they just don't talk about it.
And it's so interesting too, man, because I guess initially, well, up until this point, because we don't really know what occurred during that missing time, it would just seem like, oh, they're just irritable, they're tired.
Yeah.
It kind of caught up to them. It was, a scary experience, and now they just want to go to bed. But we're going to find out that there was a lot more to it, and a lot more that happened. So the rest of the trip actually went on without incident. The men spent about another, I think it was like 8 to 10 days out there. I think all out, they were there for about 14 days or something, or 12 days. And they never saw the bizarre light again. As the years went by, they told some friends and family about the UFO, but no one really believed them. They kind of just kept it to themselves. And really, they could hardly believe it themselves. It was weird, but, they were young, and once they got home, they didn't really talk about it. Life kept moving, and they just let it fade into the background. That is, until Jim Weiner started having the nightmares. Nightmares that came every night, vivid, terrifying, and always the same.
I was starting to have nightmares, really terrible nightmares that I could not explain. I found myself in a very brightly lit room. I had no idea where I was or why I was there. To my left, I could see my brother Jim, Chuck Rak, and Charlie Foltz sitting on some type of bench, and they were all naked. I was wondering why they weren't helping me, because I felt like I was in danger. And while I'm trying to figure this out, I notice this figure, or a dark, shadowy type figure emerging from this light, this bright light in front of me. I would wake up sweating and breathing heavily and just in a state of terror and shock.
So Jack explains that he'd wake up in this really blindly bright room. He wasn't able to move. And so I think even in a dream, that inability, we've talked before last season, especially about sleep paralysis and that feeling that you're not able to move. That's not quite this, but in a similar way, that inability to move and have any kind of control, I think is just absolutely terrifying.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He sees his friends sitting over there. They're naked on this bench, staring sort of blankly ahead. He tries calling out to them to move toward them, but then out of the light, these figures appeared. These shadowy figures with long necks, bald heads, metallic eyes, and long skeletal fingers. They would surround him, moving in this like eerie unison. And he could feel their presence in his mind. They didn't speak, but somehow he understood them. They told him, "Don't be afraid, do what we say." And then he would wake up. The nightmares kept on getting worse and worse. It was affecting his day-to-day. You know, he's losing sleep, losing focus. I mean, the best thing I can kind of relate it to is, you know, being like when you have newborns.
Oh, yeah.
And the world looks like a different color. You know, it's like green, like the Matrix, because you're like, you're partly in it, but you're partly just...
It's the worst.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah. And I mean, even just going a few days without sleep, like, can really mess up all of your, like, functions.
Right. Yeah, your mind starts to sort of just move slower. You know, you kind of forget things. It's the worst. So finally, you know, at this point, he's kind of just talked to his wife about this, you know, because she's sleeping beside him. He like wakes up in a cold sweat and maybe even like calls out. And she's like, "What's going on? Is everything okay?" And he sort of explained these dreams to her. What's really crazy is he then sort of approaches his twin brother and says, "Hey man, you know, I've been having these dreams." And then, you know, his brother kind of like wide-eyed just looks at him and is just like, "Wait a minute, I've been having these dreams too." Well, then they find out that their other two friends, the two Charleses, Rak and Foltz, have also been having these exact same dreams. So at this point, they're desperate for answers.
Yeah.
And I think it was one of the Weiner brothers that decided to go to a man named Ray Fowler. Ray Fowler is this researcher with MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and Fowler suggests to them to go through a hypnotic regression to unlock any memories they might have suppressed. And by the way, Fowler has, since this all happened, written a book about the case called the Allagash Abductions. From the beginning, Ray Fowler fully suspected, after listening to the description of their dreams and all this, that the men had been abducted by a UFO, but he didn't really tell them that right away. One by one, they underwent hypnosis. They all promised not to tell each other about what they recalled until all the sessions were complete. Each of them, Jim Weiner, Chuck Rak, Jack Weiner, and Charlie Foltz, described their experience. And then afterward, each of them drew illustrations of their incredible and terrifying recollections. We're going to be including those up on the Patreon, including those on the Instagram, because they are fascinating and terrifying. I know they're terrifying. They're fascinating. I know you'll agree with me. I love the hand-drawn witness drawings in any of these cases, you know?
Well, also, they were all like students of like an art and design college. So, you know, like some more than others, but like I think that's pretty cool because you have like a lot more sort of specific traits in these drawings. You know, like a lot of the witness drawings in in past UFO cases that maybe we've covered, like they have sort of a primitive sort of look to them. Like it'd be like if a kid drew it. But these kind of, I don't know, they're better detailed and it's pretty creepy, man. Especially like I know this isn't like a video podcast, but like the way that several of them, like the mouths, like it's slightly different from like just a typical alien gray, which I found interesting.
Yeah. I mean, if you can describe it if you want.
Well, it's like it's almost like they just don't have mouths. It's almost like their face has like a built-on like ninja mask.
Yeah,
if that makes any sense.
Hold on, pull up. It's almost like a ninja mask, but there's something like sort of almost like bird beak.
Sort of, yeah. It's like sort of
mean?
protrudes a little bit. I mean, it's kind of like a ninja mask, like from the bridge of your nose, like down, how it kind of goes out to where the end of your nose would be. But then there's no mouth. But then I think there's another one that he does have a mouth, but even that one's like really
small and weird,
sort of subdued. Yeah.
It's funny that you say ninja mask because I was just like sending Tyler yesterday. I was like texting him. I watched this movie called Pray for Death. It's an old 80s ninja movie. It's just so cool. Anyway,
dude,
so I think ninjas are on top of mind.
Well, were you like a big like American Ninja fan?
Oh yeah, dude.
God, I love those movies.
Those are great, man.
I need to check and see if they still hold up because
probably not, but that's what makes them good.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, this one's just about as cheap. We'll talk about it on the Patreon. Okay. So, one quick note. When the two brothers, Jack and Jim Weiner, were kind of talking about this with one another, they talk about like remembering, they seem to be coming, certain elements of the dream that were identical. Some type of creature, being helpless, feeling violated. It was kind of the feeling that they often woke up with. Again, they're going under hypnosis. During these sessions, some of the things that sort of were similar, I guess, were these humiliating and painful medical examinations, poked and prodded with strange devices. The aliens were forced them to strip naked and then take samples of the skin and bodily fluids, all of them, if you catch my drift.
Yeah.
Here's what's interesting. We actually have the original hypnosis sessions audio. So buckle up because this is, just listening to this is terrifying to me.
Yep.
We'll return after these messages.
It's a pretty cool place if you're a Martian.
Or a vampire. You think you really know what's happening around here, don't you? We're fighters for truth, justice, and the American way.
Hey, this is Woody.
And this is Tyler. And you're listening to That Would Be Rad.
And now, back to our show.
They don't know what to do. I think they think I'm going to come after them. I feel like I want to. I feel like I want to. The first one that comes near me, I'm going to throttle them. That's what I want to do, is throttle them. I don't like these things. I don't care where they come from. They shouldn't be doing this to people.
His brother Jack found the faces terrifying, and he said,
they're right there. Their face is right in my face. I don't know why. I don't want to know. I don't want to know what they want. Oh, they're saying things. They're explaining things with their eyes. In my head, they're saying, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. we won't harm you. They say, do what we say. Just do what we say.
Charlie Foltz was the next to be examined. And Charlie Foltz said,
I'm afraid that it's like a doctor's office. It's cold like a doctor's office is cold. They put the panel over your chest. And then they scrape your arms, your chest, your legs and thighs. We shouldn't be here. I just keep thinking I want to be back in the canoe.
And then finally, Chuck Rak had a pretty good view of what the aliens were doing to Charlie. And he said,
See some sort of device on him. They've got it looks like a silvery, and it looks like it's got curves on it. It's almost like it sucks something. He's got his head tipped way back. It's almost like he's in pain. We're just there. We can't help him. All we can do is watch him.
After the hypnosis sessions, they're all sort of brought back together. They've, at this point, also drawn these pictures. And for the first time, really, they discovered that each of them had sort of recalled the same exact horrifying events. None of them really doubted what they were seeing. They weren't just dreams anymore. These were memories. They would kind of say, like, oh yeah, I remember this, and be like, oh my God, that's exactly, what I remembered. And they would like, I think there's got to be this mix of emotion that they must have felt at the time, where on one hand, it's sort of not really energizing necessarily, but it is in some ways kind of exciting, because then you kind of feel like this justification of your dreams and like you're not just going crazy.
Oh, yeah.
And then also at the same time, probably an equal measure of just sheer terror.
Yeah.
Which,
I mean, just for like the time, I mean, we're talking like 1976. And so, you have these men who.
Now, this is 12 years later.
No. Yeah, okay. I know. But I'm saying like of that era, that time, like just the fact that like these guys are like speaking about this stuff, like sort of like candidly and showing like, I mean, because that's a pretty, I mean, all of our listeners, you can read between the lines, but that's a pretty like vulnerable sort of like situation that they were in. And so to kind of go into this, like being violated and all this stuff, like I feel like nowadays it would just be viewed a little bit differently. But back then, the fact that like they went into all that, like sort of gives a little more like credibility, I think.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And here's another clip of them sort of explaining just that.
We were amazed that Jack would say something about how he remembered the light, or Chuck Rak would say something that he remembered, or Charlie would say, and we'd sit there, my God, that's exactly what we remembered.
One person would pause to take a breath, and the next person would pick up, and you knew what they were going to say. And when they paused for breath, you could continue.
It was just amazing to come to the realizations that all these things were really true, and that they really had meaning. And it was also kind of nice to know that I wasn't going insane having these nightmares, that they were, in fact, real memories of an event that did happen.
Now, the men passed polygraph tests, psychiatric evaluations. Everything pointed to the fact that they truly believed that this had happened. So I think in a lot of these situations, instantly, there's going to be people that are skeptical. I think for the most part, these folks didn't really, aside from, the clips that we used were from the original episode of Unsolved Mysteries that talked about this case.
Oh, this is September 18th, 1994.
Aired in the mid-90s. And Tyler, I think, found 94. I found 95.
We'll fight for it later.
Well, yeah, we'll duke it out, Battle Royale style. Yeah. In any case, they had on a clinical psychologist who kind of specializes in the study of repressed memory and hypnotic therapy. And some of what he had to say was sometimes it can be sort of media-driven. In other words, just kind of like Tyler, just earlier in the episode, was sort of relating what this creature kind of looked like to him as he was describing it. It's like, well, it looks kind of like a ninja mask. Mm-hmm. What this doctor was kind of trying to say is, potentially these guys may have had these memories, in their sort of memory banks from like old 1950s UFO movies and that kind of stuff. And yeah, he kind of likens it to like, you get some of these cases on TV, other people hear about them, they think, oh, I think I may have had the same thing that happened to me. It sort of feeds upon itself. In other words, he's kind of talking about almost like a mass hysteria, I think.
Yeah, but
which can happen, sure. But here's the thing about these guys, because really that in a sense, not what he said, but in terms of the actual abduction and the event, that's basically what happened. You had these 4 friends that went out there. They saw something. There's this huge gap of missing time. Then many years later, as they're sort of being tormented by these memories almost, and here's what I think about, it's like if there's the capability of sort of repressing those things and causing that time gap within your memory, if these creatures have that ability,
right,
then at some point maybe those walls can be sort of broken down, and that's when people start to remember stuff, and it's long enough ago that you can't go back and do anything about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And so these guys are starting to get tormented by these things. They go through the hypnosis. They remember it in a lot more vivid detail, and then they kind of go about their lives. I think, like Tyler was saying, many of the things, I guess, that would sort of tick the boxes for skeptics would be, okay, well, let's give them a lie detector test. Well, they pass that. Let's give them psych evaluations. Well, they pass that. In their individual hypnosis, they all, kind of described similar things.
Yep. All their drawings, which were completely all separate, all look very, very similar.
And for the intense skeptics, they could say, arguably, well, they've had a long time to sort of plan it. Sure. But again, it always goes back to that thing, which is, and again, I'm not actually sure if they made any money off of their story, but I don't know if there's that much money in the early 90s that is worth sort of putting your name and your credibility on the line.
I don't think so. I mean,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's such a big thing. I would say from like the late 60s up until like the 90s, that was such a go-to for like your debunkers. They would be like, oh, they're just doing this to make money off, books or whatever. And it's like, to me, that's such a reach. I mean, it's like, yeah, maybe, but it's like I was saying before, it's like just sort of presenting that vulnerability. Like nowadays, it is a little bit different. But back then, I feel like absolutely not.
Well, it's still pretty similar nowadays. Like, I think there's also a distinction between like if these guys then just kind of shifted gears and they're all sort of UFO researchers now and that's all they do is write books.
Right.
Okay, that argument's a little bit more valid. You know what I mean?
Well,
but imagine like nowadays if I was like, but I'm just going to say this here. If I saw a UFO, even with the podcast, I'd be somewhat kind of like, I don't know if I, because then it's like,
oh,
I've talked professional career.
Yeah.
People are like, yeah, you can, go with this guy, but he also, he says, it can really sort of mess with
Oh, yeah.
your credibility in other areas, you know.
I mean, I've been apprehensive talking about like any of my stuff, like the orb stuff, the missing time stuff. But you know, it's like, well, this is kind of what we talk about on the podcast. But what I'm talking about, like back then especially, is like, you know, for them to come out and talk about like being violated, being probed, all this stuff. It's the same stuff that like Whitley Strieber went through with his own sort of personal abduction scenarios. And like, what I mean by that is like nowadays, you know, there's a lot more talk openly about like our mental health and our and like sensitivity to these things. Whereas back then, I just feel like it would be a lot harder just to come out publicly with that kind of stuff.
Sure.
Just to make some money on, you know, possibly.
Yeah, that's the thing. Possibly.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And also, I want to say, you know, I brought up Whitley Strieber. I love this period of time, like this period of like the 70s and then like early 80s, because what's interesting is like, you know, nowadays when we think of aliens, we think, oh, like alien grays, which ultimately was kind of like created or was put like in the public zeitgeist by the cover of Whitley Strieber's book, Communion.
Right.
Which is still, in my opinion, the scariest picture of an alien I can think of.
Yeah.
But what's cool is like once you start digging into these cases, like I said, that start like late 70s, early 80s, because everything kind of before that was, and this is why I want to push back against that debunker that said, oh, well, they're just thinking of like, you know, sci-fi movies from like the 50s and like early 60s. And it's like, yeah, but alien grays weren't a thing back then. Like that wasn't like they were sort of
robot,
retro-futuristic or like weird, like vegetable, like sort of, you know, that the alien gray thing didn't really come about until, or become mainstream until like the mid 80s. And so in that little period of time, I think it's so interesting because like all of these individual cases kind of like lead up to informing that thing. So it's like something happened in this period of the, you know, mid 70s to the early 80s where the alien grays, like that just suddenly became like the look of aliens.
Right.
Which I think is fascinating.
And then in the 90s, it was just like, that's what you had a sticker.
It was everywhere.
On your you know, a patch on your book bag, a sticker on your notebook.
I mean, Alien Workshop.
Yeah, dude.
Really helped that.
You know, come on. Amazing. X-Files, you know, all this kind of stuff. And I mean, I don't know, a lot of these too, and I think it is because of the time period and the lack of technology, a lot of these cases where they're just out in the wilderness, it's a different kind of wilderness in a way than we experience now, you know, so many years later. And it's just scarier for some reason. The technology isn't as great. You know, cell phone signal, no such thing.
Yeah.
You know, if there's an emergency, you're going to have to hike back to your car, figure it out. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
And so it's just, and then obviously, immediately I'm reminded of the Travis Walton case.
Oh, I was waiting on it.
You know, Fire in the Sky is still to this day one of those movies, man, that like I will watch every, I don't know, couple years because of how much it sort of just affects me. You know?
My buddy Jesse and I have a real obsession with that movie. And I mean, I love Signs. Like Signs is just, it's just so good. But I would say as far as like being like a terrifying alien, you know, extraterrestrial movie, I would say Fire in the Sky by far is, it just, like, I don't think there's any other movie that really captures that, like, sort of the terror in, like, abduction and being, like, violated and, like, probed and, like, him, like, being, like, dragged through the ship to be put on, like, the examination table. And, man, they just...
Yeah, the sheer terror of all that, man.
Crazy.
Captured perfectly.
Yeah. And one thing that's really interesting about that is, well, there's a lot of similarities, but I will say I have a question now with, I wonder if the like creature design for like the aliens in the movie Fire in the Sky, I wonder if they were kind of informed more by the Allagash drawings. Because if you look at them,
Mm-hmm.
Hold on, see if you can pull. Let me see.
No, I mean, he described him like this, though, and that was like 1975, so technically it was like a year.
Yeah, it was a year before. But I'm saying like the creature design is
for the movie.
Yeah, for the movie, like it has that it has that sort of like protruding ninja mask type thing going on, which I think is really cool. But one thing too, this going back to the similarities, there were 7 men, including Travis Walton, in that incident in 1975, and they all also passed polygraph tests, and both out in the woods, way far away from each other. But I do think it's interesting that these two cases that almost seem like identical, especially with like the craft like showing interest and like following, and then like the hardcore like sort of probing and all that kind of examination kind of stuff, all happening within like a year of each other. It's so interesting.
And then the way that they looked too was similar. And then Tyler mentioned that they're in different locations. I think the Travis Walton one was in Arizona. Again, this one is in Maine, which is like the northeasternmost sort of tip of the U.S., I believe.
Yeah.
I always wanted to go to Maine.
Dude, I have too,
I haven't been there, man.
Same.
Soon, but not yet. All right. So, one last thing about Fire in the Sky that I wanted to say is, to me, another excellent thing about that story and that movie was how they depicted how the other guys are like, dude, please, man, just stop talking about it.
Yeah.
Like, we're getting all this attention. We don't want it. We don't want to talk about that night. People think we're weird. We're just a bunch of loggers, man. You know? And when you think about it and you view all of these people through that lens, it is so much different than, because like, are there people that want the attention? Do they want a chance to like tell this elaborate story and get attention for it? Sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure that exists in a lot of these kind of things.
Well, but also in the Fire in the Sky sort of case, they all part of that gives credibility is they filed like a missing person, which is like, I mean, it just seems like a weird step.
Yeah, and they witnessed this beam of light come down,
which is
and the
such
same thing was kind of
iconic.
like this light situation.
Yeah, exactly.
The other one that we're gonna be talking about later in the season, I mean, I almost feel like we might have to do it pretty soon here. Similarly, it had like beams of light, and this happened in Mississippi. I'm not going to give it away.
Pascagoula.
Come on, man.
It's actually the only Mississippi one that I know of. So.
Okay. But there's actually like a handful of cases, and like later on tonight, dude, I want to kind of talk about them in the Patreon, because there's some that I'm like, man, have we talked about that? Or did I just happen to watch a documentary about it and we planned on talking about a different one that is just, there's almost like, I don't know, I wrote down close to 10 other UFO abduction cases that really have a lot of similarities. They're not quite in the same time period, but they kind of are. There's like 1974, 1978, 78 through 81.
It's that period, man. Like,
yeah, man.
It's there's something like going on. Yeah, it's weird. And
now let me ask you this real quick. Betty and Barney Hill, their descriptions of the creatures, they were kind of on the grayish side too, right?
Yeah,
because that's like in the 60s.
They were, but I don't think it was exactly.
I mean, I don't think they had the ninja face.
They did kind of have that. I mean, they had like the little nose, but then theirs had like pupils and like yellow eyes. So. I mean, kind of the bald, like, head shape is kind of similar, but you know what's interesting is that the Betty and Barney Hill images kind of look closer to the Aleister Crowley lamb drawing, which is kind of where my mind goes to, which is like, I mean, I don't want to like give it all out, but like, to me, that's like closer to like sort of a spiritual, possibly demonic kind of thing,
Yeah. Well, let's kind of talk about sort of our closing thoughts about this case in general.
We will return after these messages. stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Hey, this is Woody.
And this is Tyler. And you're listening to That Would Be Rad.
And now, back to our show. For me, it goes on the list of one of the favorites because, again, you've got multiple witnesses. You've got the fact that they, did the polygraph tests and psych evals and hypnosis and all that. And when I say pass the test, I don't mean that it proves it to me necessarily. Mm-hmm. I just mean it makes it extremely interesting because all the time with any of these cases or these incidents where someone observes something or witnesses anything, even a creature or cryptid or anything like that, mm-hmm. It's always amazing to me to put myself in their shoes and to feel that sort of terror and the horror behind like the unknown and the fact that there's this realization that must just kind of wash over them that the things that we know, it doesn't end there. I mean, you know what I mean? There's like more than what we've been told. There's more than what we understand. And there's stuff out there that is more powerful than we are. And that is terrifying if you're sort of coming in contact with it mm-hmm. and you don't really have control, in other words. Mm-hmm. I can tell you one thing. If I'm ever out canoeing in the middle of nowhere or if I'm hiking and this giant glowing orb starts to follow me.
You're taking Magic Mind.
No. Dude, that would have been, dang it. I need to reach out to them because that would have been perfect.
It would have been perfect.
No, man, I'm not sending it an SOS signal. I'm just hiding where I can and trying to observe it. But, even it reminds me of those movies where it's like once you start like recording it or something like that, it senses that signal. It's like, huh? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, even Travis Walton was sort of like inquisitive. Like he's the one who got out of the truck and was like approaching, was like, whoa, I got to get a better look for this. And it's like I said at the top, it's that old saying. It's like once you look enough at the abyss, eventually the abyss looks back at you.
Right.
And that's just,
dude, I just thought of this. Do you think, and I don't know because I don't know if the data behind this, I haven't looked it up. It's just something that you said triggered me to think this. Do you think that we don't hear about stuff like this as much now because people are just like, what's that in the sky? Nope. Drive off, leave it alone. Like we've all been inundated culturally with scary movies and stuff that follow this in our zeitgeist. We're confronted with like, if there's a noise in a scary movie, you don't walk towards it. If you're in the woods at night and you see this giant glowing orb, don't start SOS signaling it from your campsite. People are more sort of timid to go towards it, or do you think like the abductions are just getting better?
Well, so that's what's weird. I wonder if a lot of the stuff just kind of gets it just becomes like background noise because there is so much like other stuff happening. And maybe, this is like by far my absolute favorite. I love the 60s and even some of the 50s, like just sort of high strangeness, associated with those sort of UFO or extraterrestrials. But for me, as far as like the Greys and like that 70s, 80s, up until like the 90s, I don't know. It's like I feel like you like so many of these cases like made like national news. And so I think because we're just so inundated with like, everybody's having an experience and everybody like that it just, a lot of the stuff we're just not seeing, or when we do see it, we're like, that's probably fake. Which kind of sucks for like those people,
Well, it's also a time when like, dude, there's so many like convincing videos.
I know.
That like it's created and then somebody will be like, I made this with AI, and you're like, geez, dude, that looks real as heck, man.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So it is a weird time. And then also another factor probably is, there's less people going out and doing stuff like this, going out into the woods, So maybe it's like a culmination of all of those factors.
Well, you say like a lot of people, like maybe it's that like people are just like, nope, not looking at that. But then at the same time, like, I mentioned Dr. Stephen Greer earlier, and I mean, he goes out like on all these, like monthly sort of, like he takes these groups out into the desert, and like they all have laser pointers, and they're like, okay, we're going to sit here and we're going to like focus our thoughts on this, on these lights to do this one thing. And it's really interesting because it does usually, like, they do whatever they're thinking. And to me, that goes back to...
Wait, what do you mean by that?
So he sort of sets it up almost more like a meditation kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so they have these laser pointers and they're like looking up at the sky, and they have like telescopes and stuff, and they're like, okay, we're gonna like focus our intentions on these things to show up. And then they do, and then like, you'll see these videos where like him or like another guy will be like, okay, I really want it to go left, and suddenly it goes left. I really want it to go right. And to me, well, number one, I think that's not a great idea.
Yeah.
Number two, it takes me back to this speech, and I always mess up like the details. I need to do like a show on this so that it's like documented. But it was like a speech that was given at like a UFO convention years and years ago. They had this special guest who was the head of Skunk Works at Lockheed Martin. And so Skunk Works and Lockheed Martin, it's like a sort of military contractor, and they're the ones who come up with like the like stealth bomber, the like Lockheed, like all like SR-71, like they come up with very, very advanced aircraft, and then they sort of contract stuff for the U.S. military. Yeah. And so this would have been in like I think it was in the 90s, and he gives this speech, and then these guys, like, I think, UFO researchers, I think they were really young, but they ended up being like pretty predominant, like big time UFO researchers in the field later on. But they kind of run after him as he was leaving, and they're like, well, what did you mean by this? What did you mean? And he's like, well, they're like, well, what is the secret to like space travel? And he's like, well, let me ask you a question. Do you believe in ESP, which is like extrasensory perception? It's like, based on like telepathy and sort of psi phenomenon stuff. Mm-hmm. And they're like, you mean like telepathy? Maybe. Yeah. And he's like, that's the secret. And so it always reminds me of that. It's like there is some sort of like mental sort of telepathic like link to whatever we're seeing. And like, I don't know if that means like, I don't know if he meant we figured out a way to like man these ships by using our minds, or, and again, this was like 90s. So, but yeah, it's that idea that
I'll get out there in the desert and they're like, man, we're here. We're going to use our minds. Step one. Okay. Like if everybody could just disrobe. And you're like,
it always leads to that.
Like that would be our luck. I'd be like, dude, I'm open to, let's go. We're going to do it. Mm-hmm. And we get there and they're like, okay, step one, everybody, we got to be free. We got to be free of our earthly possessions. Yeah. Everybody just disrobe. And you're like, dang, man, I knew it. They just said, bring a laser pointer. You didn't say anything about getting naked, man.
He's another guy. Stephen Greer is another guy that, man, I really go back and forth on, because him and like the UFO Disclosure Project and all that stuff, like there's a lot of stuff that he says that I really get into and I can really get behind. But then there's the other stuff like, oh, all these aliens are just benevolent beings, and they're trying to help our world and tell us not to use nuclear weapons and stop climate change. And it's just like, come on, dude. And then also he's doing that, but then like when he's taking these groups out, it's like $5,000 to go. And it's sort of like, I get it, but
yeah.
But yeah, I think there's definitely a danger in that.
I thought you were going to say disrobing.
There's a real freedom in disrobing. Mm-hmm. I will say, when I mentioned my buddy Jesse, I've talked about him before for a long time listeners, probably my oldest friend. I met him in 4th grade, and my 5th grade birthday party, we saw a UFO. But it was weird because we were only able to see it and I've talked about this numerous times, but we were only able to see it through the tent like screen, like the zipper sort of mosquito screen. And I think him and I have both talked about that feeling like it knew that we were watching it.
Right.
Which is interesting because it's also the exact feeling that I got when like I was experiencing
The
like
orbs.
the orbs. Yeah, it was like I knew that like, oh, if I look at this thing, it knows that I'm looking at it and it'll disappear. And every single time it did that.
And this brings me to like my kind of point with, especially specifically with your interactions, but then just in general. I think that this other possibility exists for all this too. I think so often with ufology and just any of this stuff, there tends to be this like, we have to sort of label it as X, Y, or Z.
Right.
And I think what I've come to learn over now the 5th season of our show is like, I kind of feel like there's a bunch of different stuff that's happening.
Same.
Some of it might be related. Some of it might not be at all. You know, those orbs that you saw in your loft might have just been some fey creatures.
Yeah.
The thing that these guys saw, I don't know. And it's weird because then, too, specifically to this case, you start thinking, well, what are these creatures doing? Why are they pulling them in here? Well, then I'm reminded of one of our other favorite books that we talk about a lot, which is Passport to Magonia.
Oh, yeah.
By Jacques Vallée, where he goes through history and he talks about different interactions people have had with beings from somewhere else, from the sky, quote unquote, the sky, you know, where they were kind of collecting people for breeding purposes.
Yeah.
And you start to wonder, okay, well, are they just doing some like experimental breeding experiments? Yeah. Also, like, are they still taking volunteers? Like, were they taking volunteers or are they still signing up? Can we, like, how does that work?
Yeah.
What do the aliens look like? Are they hot?
I mean, there are some of those cases.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. Like, in his book, he talks about how some of them were like, you know, just fair-skinned, like almost like what I imagine, like elvish. You know what I mean?
Well, and that's like I've always thought.
And they come down from these like.
Well, the Nordics, that's what they call them.
Yeah. And they come down from these like craft. And then they'll say sometimes, you know, we'll bring them back. And then some of them come back, some of them don't.
Yeah.
You know, there's all that kind of stuff that's going on. And we're talking, when I say in history, I'm not talking about 1920. I'm talking like, you know, medieval times and like that kind of thing.
Yep.
And so this stuff has been happening. Are they from another planet? Are they from another dimension? Are they from here? Do they walk amongst us?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it is weird. And I mean, I've said it 10 times on this episode, but I do think whatever was happening in that 70s, 80s up to 90s period, I mean, this is going to sound out there, but, and I'm not like totally married to this idea, but I think we've talked about this when we talked about some of the like Steven Spielberg stuff and the possibility that he was sort of privy to some knowledge, you know, with like the government being tied. So there's this long time urban legend, and we should probably just do an episode on it because it's pretty fascinating. I mean, we kind of touched on it, but it's this idea that there was a period of time when Eisenhower was supposed to be flown to like Florida for or what we were told, quote unquote, for like an emergency, like dental something procedure. I think they've figured out that he actually flew to, I think it was Roswell, actually, you know, near like the White Sands, like testing, like bombing range and stuff. And it's this, the urban legend is basically that around this time, Eisenhower made a deal with quote unquote aliens to where, hey, you're allowed to, you know, you can do like cattle mutilations, you can abduct a certain number of people. I mean, it gets wild, but and there's a lot more to it, a lot more sort of detailed. I'm just
you're like, hey, sit down. Okay.
Well, this is off the top of my head, but
sit down. We don't want you killing everybody.
Yeah.
But you can carve up a couple cows here and there or horses.
Oh yeah.
And when you do, just drop them. You know, as you're flying through the air, just drop them back down.
Well, it's the idea that he basically made a deal with the extraterrestrials that they could abduct, they could, you know, do testing, examinations, blah, 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 for exchange for technology. And I mean, I'm not saying that this is what this is, but I do find it really interesting that in this period of time is where we kind of see like all of that stuff happening. We see that's where, Linda Moulton Howe, you see like tons of like the cattle mutilation stuff. You see tons of like the abduction kind of sort of story was like everywhere. By the mid 70s or the mid 80s where, actually I guess 87, I think, Communion came out, Whitley Strieber. And, he was really open about like the probing thing. And it's really kind of sad because for such a horrible thing to have happened, he became like a total joke. So anytime anybody brought him up, immediately they talked about, oh, well, he's being probed,
like as a joke or whatever.
As a joke, which
it sucks, man.
It sucks, yeah.
And it kind of goes back to what you're talking about with these guys and Travis Walton and most people in these cases. Like, why would they come forward and talk about something that would be? It's kind of like, well, we're not going to say the word, but we'll just say any kind of victim, of something bad. It's difficult for them to come forward because there's the self-blame stuff. There's fear that people will think of them differently, look at them differently. Yeah, dude.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really horrible. But I don't know. There is something in this period that is very unique from like other times. I sent you these photos too. And the thing that I think is interesting, if you look at all of them, so like the Ninja Mask ones.
God, that last one looks exactly like you. Like if they did like a breeding experiment with you and one of their creatures, that's what it looks like.
You are so dumb. So dumb. But no, I sent you a picture of the Aleister Crowley one, his communication with this creature called Lamb. And that's the one, that's like the real, like, it looks kind of like an old man.
Yeah, almost like a priest.
Yeah, like to me, that one looks like the Betty and Barney Hill one. And then the Allagash, though, and then the Travis Walton stuff, somewhere along the line, they no longer had pupils. You start seeing like the big black eyes, and then like they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then up into the 90s, as we know, like the black eyes, these almond-shaped oil black eyes, they're like almost the whole face. There's sometimes no mouth at all. 2 little dots for noses, no ears. And then the heads, I feel like, get bigger too.
Right.
So it's really interesting because the other thing...
is anybody still seeing grays right now, for example?
I think so. Yeah.
Really?
I think so. Yeah. One of the things, but those earlier ones where you did see like pupils, like, so we're talking Aleister Crowley in like the, I guess like 30s, 40s or whatever. And then... even up into the 60s, Betty Barney Hill, like they had like the pupils, and some of those they kind of even could lean into like some of the fairy abduction stuff. Whereas, once we get later on, you get like the black eyes. Some people have suggested that the black eyes are actually like some form of like goggles, or like maybe even they're not like totally organic, so they're like almost robotic.
Yeah.
And the black eyes are almost like
this is some kind of suit and mask.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And
it's intimidating.
Yeah, it's definitely intimidating.
It's that scene from Back to the Future when he's like got the hazmat suit on and the Walkman, and he's like,
it's so cold, and you don't know what they're thinking, because your eyes are, the window to the soul, because they like provide expression. And
so there's so many brave like internet trolls, man.
Yeah, right. Right. Oh, yeah.
Well, I mean, in short, I think just like many of the cases, the famous ones that exist, there's a lot of similarities here. But again, kind of like what I said in the beginning, this sort of has aspects of all the things that we love. And there's just, vulnerability that's involved in there. This, friends just hanging out. And then the terror that sort of followed them around for a long time.
Yeah.
I just love it. I'm glad that we covered it.
Oh yeah, dude. It's just a classic case, and it's you have Ray Fowler involved. He was like a sort of a giant in like ufology, sort of boots on the ground researcher kind of thing. And those guys are just, I don't know. I don't know that we'll ever. I don't know. I mean, we have those kind of guys now in a different way. Like you have like Jeremy Corbell, which kind of go back and forth on. But those, I just feel like those guys, like back in that era, like, you know, Stan Friedman, like, you know, they're literally getting in their car and driving 1,000 miles to, like, in hopes of just finding something, you know,
right.
To glean from like the actual location. And I don't know that many folks or researchers are doing that nowadays, you know.
Mm-hmm. Now, one quick thing before we leave, listeners, please, if you know of any sort of more modern alien gray sightings that I'm, you know, unaware of, that aren't just like Reddit posts, like if there's other known cases, I would love to hear about them. Not that I, you know, even if there are Reddit posts, throw them our way too. But I'm just super fascinated about that because it's like late 90s to early 2000s. I feel like there's just like this cliff, and that's when I was in college anyway, so I wasn't paying attention.
What's sort of like the coast to coast sort of era too.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, it is weird because I haven't really thought of that. Like,
there's all kinds of like UFO sightings.
Oh, yeah.
But there's not really any mention to me that I know of, again, and it's my ignorance, my bad, but you don't really hear about like anyone coming forward and being like, man, there were these grays and there, you know what I mean? Do they look different now because, you know, the look evolved over time?
Yeah.
And maybe that's why we don't hear about them. Maybe they look more human now.
I mean, maybe.
More human than human.
Before we go, okay, here's the big question to sort of be the exclamation point of the episode.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on, what do you think in this particular time, this little window of, you know, late 70s, 80s up to 90s, okay. What do you think these entities are? Would you say spiritual, extraterrestrial? What do you think?
Oh, man. Exclamation point or another half hour?
Question mark.
Yeah. Oh, boy. I don't know, man. I really don't. I don't know. I know that's not really a great answer.
Yeah.
It's one that I would kind of be mad at my kids about.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure. I feel like I'm so torn internally, mentally about, is it other dimensions? Is it interplanetary travel?
Yeah.
I don't know, man.
So I'm going to give mine. I think I really struggle with this. And this is something that like I almost feel like I'm betraying young Tyler, who was like so big into like UFOs
Nuts and bolts.
And ET. Wait, what?
Nuts and bolts.
Yeah, kind of a little bit.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, everything was, you know, extraterrestrial and interplanetary travel, and it's all from space, and they're using like, you know, wormholes and like, you know, gravity disrupting, you know, technology and all this kind of stuff. But then I don't know. I mean, since the show and since, you know, 200 plus episodes, we've went down all these different roads, and I just feel like there's a lot more of a spiritual component tied in with this stuff. And it's funny because me growing up in a tiny little Baptist church in Cleveland, you know, North Georgia, as a kid, that was the stuff that I would hear, you know, them say like, oh, those are just, you know, they're just demons. And I would be like, this person is so closed-minded. It's so dumb, you know. But now I kind of do feel like there is a lot more of that. However, where my mind doesn't quite, it sort of battles with that is like in this particular period, there was so much like nuts and bolts and like physical kind of like, you know, examination, like they're just sort of studying us. Like there was a lot more of that going on. And so I do wonder if like, was this like more of like a government thing, and these sort of like the idea of like screen memories and stuff, like was all of this just conducted by our own government or other governments, possibly from another time or another dimension? Like, I don't know. It's so interesting, and it's like it's such a pivotal time in, you know, the ufology timeline.
Yeah.
So
I mean, yeah, I don't know. We should let's leave it at that. I mean, I could add in some stuff here, but I'm not sure that it's going to make sense because I'm not I don't know. That's an interesting thought that I would rather just kind of stew on for a minute.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you have your own idea of what this is or what these abductions are, send them over to our Instagram. Jump in the comments section. Tell us you're new to the show. If you're old to the show, we'd love to hear from you as well. If you want to tell us your story, maybe your own paranormal, UFO sighting, like a possible ghost, shadow man, whatever, drop us a DM, or if it's more long form, shoot it to thatwouldberadpod@gmail.com. Even better, and possibly with the possibility of appearing in a future episode, you can do that by leaving a voice memo of your story or a local legend, whatever, over at thatwouldberadpodcast.com, where you hit the button, you record your story, and we supply the cool sound design, and you could possibly hear your own story somewhere down the line. If you want to support the show, the best possible way to do that is over on our Patreon, the Rabbit Trail. It's just sort of a real-time way of giving your financial support to the show, and it really helps keep the train on the tracks. We absolutely are so grateful, and we really love our listeners over here on the free feed and over on the Patreon. It means the world to us. Give us a 5-star review. Tell a single friend about the show. And I guess that's about it. You got anything else, Woody?
I think that's all, man.
All right, guys. Well, we're humming along here on season 5. And stick with us. We got a good one. So we love you. We appreciate you. And as always,
be rad.
That's the way it goes. Time where I just needed some sunshine. You were already dead before you became a ghost. You always said our future would be a parade of flowers, but now all that's left is a single rose. That's the way it goes.
Access granted.
If you were to tell somebody 40 years ago that they would be able to see on an invention called a television set, which didn't exist, a meteorite crashing into a planet that they can now watch at home, that's a reality check, folks. And yet, 40 years ago, that's science fiction. This happened. If you believe it, that's all right. If you don't believe it, I don't care. I don't care, because it did.
Shh.